And as I told you yesterday that some of the case laws I'll be discussing with you on the preamble to the Constitution of India with the different words which have been used in the preamble to the Constitution of India. So the opening words of the preamble, that is, we the people of India, which I told you that this gives the source from which the Constitution comes and derives its power. That is to say that the preamble speaks of serving the purposes of that what has been declared for the people of India. And because it is the source of the Constitution, so we see that the sovereignty of the Indian polity that also rests in the people of India. So we the people of India, when we talk of this thing, then we find that we the people is considered to be the source of the Constitution and the power. So we can say that this theory which propounds that the Constitution has been made by them and not by the ruler, and that it is not made by any external authority, or we can say that that is the common will of the people of India. That is what we are having in the Constitution. So we, the people of India, is like that, and hence the source of the Constitution is the will of the people, which is said to be the ultimate authority lies with the people of India. And to the similar impact or effect, we see that in A.K. Gopalan versus the state of Madras, this was of a 1950 judgment, and where Justice Patanjali Shastri, he spoke for the people of India that they are exercising their sovereign will, which is expressed in the preamble to the Constitution of India. So when Justice Patanjali Shastri observed regarding we the people of India, so he observed that our constitution appears from the preamble, that it derives its authority from the preamble or from the people of the India. And to similar, we can say, effect, one more judgment was given by the Supreme Court in B.R. Kapoor versus State of Tamil Nadu. It was 2001 Supreme Court. And this was the case where the will of the people that was questioned towards the constitutional provisions in a democratic setup like India. And the court, in this case, was of the opinion that they are ascribing, or the solemn duty of the court is to interpret the constitution. And while interpreting the constitution, the court finds that it is manifestly there is an unauthorized exercise of the power under the constitution, and it would uphold the provisions and the will of the people. So the court has the duty to honor the provisions of the Constitution, because these provisions in the Constitution are the will of the people, and which is the which he has put on the highest pedestal. And that's why we see that the Supreme Court in this B.R. Kapoor case also given the interpretation that we, the people of India, they are the source of the Constitution. So it can be argued that the people of India, they have given this constitution to themselves. In that way, there are some propositions also which have been raised in Keshwaran Bharti versus State of Kerala case, and that the constitution was framed and adopted by the Constituent Assembly, everybody knows, and that the Constituent Assembly was not even elected by the people directly, we all know. And the constitution was not approved by the people through a referendum, as I told you yesterday also. So the question whether the Supreme Court could inquire into the correctness of the use of the expression, this we the people of India, was correct or not. And in Keshwaran Bharti case, you see that the Supreme Court, though it has not pronounced on this particular point, because there was a difference of opinion among the judges. And you see, Justice Matthews, he observed that the Constitution proceeded with the people and can only be taken as a verbal declaration, or what exactly Justice Matthews said, that this can be taken as a rhetorical flourish, which is probably to be in the Constitution preamble as a foundation on more solid basis of the popular will, and to give the supremacy, or which is to be supremacy or ultimate supremacy to the people of India. And this is only a constitutional fiction, and it cannot be questioned in any court of law, because the constitution has been enforced in 1950, and now after 23 years of its enforcement, this time if the legitimacy has to be checked, or its correctness has to be checked, then it's not the right time, because the court said that Justice Matthews particularly, he observed that the fact that the constitution was adopted by the people of the India and by the founding fathers, so they were having the belief in their mind that they are fully, representing the people of India. So when they are representing the people of India, then they can do this, and that's why Justice Matthews observed that we cannot check the correctness of this, and this is only a constitutional fiction. Then in the same case, you see Justice Hegde and Justice Mukherjee, they were also of the similar opinion when they said that the anyone who knows the composition of the Constituent Assembly, because we all know how the Constituent Assembly was constituted, and their voice was said to be the voice of the people. So they were truly the representatives of the people, and they were, though elected through a very, very, narrow franchise, but still they were having the voice of the people of India, and therefore the question or the correctness of the preamble cannot be checked in this time. And the constitution that was framed and has been accepted, that has been working for the last 23 years, and this is not the right time or to question as to whether that is correct or not. So the fact that the people of this country, they gave the constitution to themselves, is a correct version. This is in view of the Justice Hegde and Justice Mukherjee. Then another judge in the same case, Justice Jagmohan, he was also observing on the point of the questionability or the correctness of the preamble to the Constitution of India. And Justice Jagmohan said that the people of India who have adopted, they have enacted, and they have given this Constitution to themselves. So the Constitution is acting upon for the last 23 years, and every power and authority is purported to be exercised by the Constitution. We know that the majority, in the vast majority, rather, the people have acting under the Constitution. The courts are deriving their powers from the Constitution. There are elected members in the parliament, in the state legislatures, and 5 general elections have been completed after that enforcement of the Constitution. And all these propositions makes it unquestionable and indisputable that the source and the binding force of the Constitution is the sovereign will of the people of India. So the initial 5 words which I was talking about, that is we the people of India, on that point the Supreme Court in A.K. Gopalan, in B.R. Kapoor, and in Keshwanand Bharti, in these cases clearly observed that there is no question that we the people of India is the source of the Constitution, and their sovereign will is to be considered as the sovereign. And that's why the Supreme Court in these 3 judgments has not directly propounded, particularly in Keshwanand Bharti, on the point that whether it is correct or not, but it is accepted, enforced, and enacted, and the authorities have derived their power from the Constitution. They are working properly. So it is not the right time now to check the virus of the Constitution and the preamble, whether it is correct or not. So this is the first part, that is we the people. Then the second thing which is there in the preamble, that is the sovereign. Now, when we talk about the sovereign, then there are certain definitions which have been given for the term sovereign by various political scientists as well as jurists also. And according to Cooley, he was a constitutional law author and has written a book on the constitutional law also. So, in his view, this sovereign is something which we see that is having a supreme and absolute power, and which acknowledges no superior. So, according to Pule, who is a constitutional law author, and in his opinion, the sovereign is that state is sovereign when there is no supreme, when it has supreme and absolute power, and when there is no superior, or it acknowledges no superior from the external power. So this is what a sovereign state means. So sovereignty resides with the state and within itself as a supreme power, as an absolute power, without acknowledging any other superior. And secondly, according to Hobbes, he also defined sovereign. And in his opinion, sovereignty is universal, which is unlimited, and which is illimitable. That means that that is something which cannot be limited by any rules, with any regulations, which cannot be limited by the other authorities, and which is something which is illimitable, which cannot be limited. So in Hobbes terms, we see that the sovereignty is universal, sovereignty is unlimited, sovereignty is illimitable. Then according to Austin, who is a founder of the positivism, and in his view, everybody knows law is the command of sovereign. So for that sovereign, he speaks about the internal sovereignty, that is the power to compel obedience, that the community, the society, or that that the group of the society, or which is there, then they must be compelled to follow, they must be compelled to obey whatever command is being given by the sovereign. So in that term, this internal sovereignty is defined as power to compel the obedience. Then when we talk about Locke, so Locke was the first, jurist who has given a hint for the sovereignty, that the sovereignty rests in the people, in as much as we see that he felt that the people had the right to throw out the government if it is not fulfilling their demand, if it is not fulfilling certain conditions, if it is not working on the points for which the government has to work. So sovereignty is something that rests in the people. This was the opinion of Locke. Then if you see Rousseau, then he also speak about the popular sovereignty, and that popular sovereignty is nothing but that is the will of the people. So you see that Locke and Rousseau, they both talked about the will of the people, or the sovereignty that resides in the people of the particular communities or society wherever that sovereign works upon. So we the people, that sovereignty, which is the will of the people, that is said to be the that is the will of the people, that rests in the people. So Locke and Rousseau, they were very near to what has been, said in the Supreme Court judgments in A.K. Gopalan as well as in B.R. Kapoor case also. Then another definition which is given for the sovereignty, that was of A.V. Dicey. So A.V. Dicey, you know that he worked for the rule of law, and in Britain, according to him, that he has given his sovereignty in terms of the king, that is the king of Britain. So he was of the opinion that the king in parliament is the sovereign, de jure. That is legally the king in the parliament is the sovereign, but with the change in the political, nature there, or with the advent or with the starting of this adult franchise, universal adult franchise, the sovereignty is now coming into the people of that particular country. Meaning thereby that if you talk about the sovereignty and if it's a democratic nation and if the adult franchise is there, then it seems that the sovereignty resides in the people of that particular country because they have the power to throw them out from the power if they are not working according to the rules, according to the norms on the basis of which they have got that particular power. So you see that Locke, Rousseau, and Dicey, they all these three, they were speaking about the sovereignty in terms of the nation where the sovereignty lies in the people or in the people of that particular country. When we talk about the sovereignty in traditional terms, then we see that today no state can be said to be fully sovereign. As I was discussing yesterday also, because of the membership of various international organizations like United Nations, European Union, and international treaties, accords, conventions, documents, they all, I mean, you see, they cast an obligation on the state parties, on the sovereignty of that particular state. And that also put certain restrictions, and we see that in some of the books the writers they have also written that these type of the restrictions have also eroding the sovereignty of that particular state. But there is one more point which is needed here to be discussed, that is regarding the membership of the Commonwealth. We all know that India is a member of the Commonwealth countries, and this is also one of the extension that being member of the Commonwealth, whether India can say that it is sovereign or not. So we see that when the constitution was being drafted at that time also this question was raised that how we can say ourselves to be a republic, because India is a member of the Commonwealth, and at that time that is under the restriction and obligations of the rules and regulations which are to be there in the Commonwealth. So the membership of the Commonwealth did not in any way dilute the sovereignty of India, because it was settled during the Constituent Assembly itself. And you see that in April 1949, there was a resolution in the Commonwealth which was reported that the governments who are the members of the Commonwealth, they will continue to be the sovereign in their own republic. And they have also accepted India's membership even after it became a sovereign republic. So April 1949 was the year in that meeting, in that conference of the Commonwealth, that this has been resolved that India would continue to be a member of the Commonwealth, and even after its membership, it will continue if it becomes a sovereign republic. So there is sovereignty has not been touched being member of the Commonwealth. Similarly, if we talk about the other international organizations, then this is the new normal, we can say, with the advent of the international organizations, and every state party they have to work for the rights of the common man. And that's why we see that the sovereignty is something different, and membership of these organizations, international organizations, and they though put certain obligations and restrictions, but it cannot be said that they erode the sovereignty of the independent state. So this is one thing. Then it can another argument regarding the constitutional and legal sovereign, that it restrains the limited powers and it restrains the sovereigns also. But you see that the modern theories which are working on this, they are working on the political sovereignty, and they see that there is something which is absolute, which is unlimited. So, in simple words, we see that the theory of the sovereignty that is fit for any of the complex situations in the modern life. And the only thing is that though sovereignty is difficult to define, but we see that the sovereignty is something which confers the power on the state to work for its people. And this power of sovereignty is further we see that subjected by the constitutional limitations itself. If we talk about the sovereignty in the state under the terms of the constitution, then you see that the powers of the legislature, the powers of the executive, the powers of the judiciary even to certain extent have been limited by the constitutional provisions itself. And this is what we also see in the judgments of the Synthetic and Chemicals Limited versus State of UP, 1990 Supreme Court. When the court was of the opinion that though it is not subject to any external authority, but the state has the power to legislate on any subject in conformity with the constitutional limitations. For example, if we say that the parliament, we have opted for the federal constitution, federal system of the governance, and in that federal system, the powers have been distributed among the states and the union. So the constitutional limitation on the legislative power of the parliament is there in the constitution itself. Seventh schedule to the constitution, which provides for the three lists: list 1, list 2, and list 3, union list, state list, and concurrent list. So the limitation is like parliament, that is the union, can legislate only on those items which are there in list 1, that is the union list, and list 3, that is the concurrent list, and not on the second list, that is the state list, barring some abnormal situations, that is when there is a proclamation of emergency or there is a failure of the constitutional machinery in the state and the power has been conferred upon on the parliament accordingly. So these are the constitutional limitations on the legislative power. Similarly, we see the executive and judicial powers are also constitutionally limited. If the law is enacted by the parliament, that is against part 3rd of the constitution, that is a limit. That is the fundamental rights are the limits on the power of the legislature. So in Synthetics and Chemicals Limited versus the State of UP 1990, the Supreme Court said that though the country, that is India, that is sovereign and it is not controlled by any of the external authority, but the power of the legislatures on the subjects in conformity with the constitutional limitations that has to be named. So sovereign means in India that it is independent politically and it is not subordinate to anyone, but at the same time it has to work in the constitutional limitations. Then regarding sovereignty, there was one more case decided by the Supreme Court in 1990 itself, that is Charan Lal Sahu versus the Union of India. Now, in this Charan Lal Sahu versus Union of India, you know that this was a case in which one of the act, that is Bhopal Gas Leak Disaster Act of 1985, that was challenged. The constitutional virus of that act was challenged in this particular case. This was the act which was enacted as an outcome of the Bhopal gas leak in Bhopal, and the power of representation has been taken by the government of India to sue on behalf of the people of those people who got injured and whose lives who were dead in that Bhopal gas leak disaster, and that's why this act was challenged in this Charan Lal Sahu case. And here you see the court on the point of sovereignty. I'm not going to discuss as to what were the other decisions in Charan Lal Sahu, though the act was declared constitutional in this case. But regarding sovereignty, what the court said in this case is that the reason that we are sovereign is shown by the doctrine of parens patriae. Now, parens patriae is a doctrine which speaks of that the state shall work as a guardian of its people. And the reason that we are sovereign, this doctrine is applied, and this particular act which conferred the power to act by the government of India as a representative of those people, and it is working in that nature as a parens patriae, as the guardian of that particular persons who got injured and who were died in that Bhopal gas leak case. and that can be invoked by the state, because the state is assuming the power to represent its people in order to get justice. So if the justice has to be delivered, if the people who are in the need of justice, and if the state is taking over the power as parens patriae, this can be done only by a sovereign. And hence India is a sovereign country, and in that sovereign nature, the law which has been enacted by the parliament to have the parens patriae role and to have the representative suit, that is absolutely constitutional and not violated. Then, besides the Supreme Court decisions, there are provisions in the Constitution itself. If you go through Article 1, Subclause 3, Subclause 3, C, 1, 3C of the Constitution, then you'll find that the Constitution makes it clear that the Union of India could acquire foreign territory. And in Re Berubari case, you see that the court held that one of the attributes of the sovereignty is the power to cede parts of national territory if necessary. So this is the power that resides with the sovereign state, and that power has been conferred by Article 1(3)(c) of the Constitution, and this was also the judgment of the Supreme Court in Re Berubari case. Then another case is Magan Bhai Ishwar Bhai Patel of 1969 Supreme Court, when the court said that the union can cede its territory subject to necessary constitutional amendments. But at the same time, you see Article 4 of the Constitution also, which speaks about the that anything which is done in Article 2 and 3, that is regarding the establishment of the new states, or the changing of the boundaries of the state, or bifurcation of the states, giving new names to the state, altering the name of the states, existing states. So this is all can be done by the ordinary legislations, and they will not be treated as the amendment within the meaning of Article 368. So this Magan Bhai Chhagan Bhai case of 1916, Magan Bhai Ishwar Bhai Patel case of 1969, that the court has very categorically said that the union can cede its territory subject to the necessary constitutional amendment. And we see Article 2, 3, and 4 of the Constitution that confers this power on the Union Parliament. And by virtue of this power, you see that after the enforcement of the Constitution since 1950, and there are many new states that have been created by virtue of these provisions by the ordinary legislations. And at the same time, the boundaries of some of the states have also been altered, and some of the big states have also been bifurcated, and new states have been made, and that is through the ordinary legislations also, as it is there in Article 2, 3, and 4 of the Constitution. And names have also been changed of the existing states, and you see that UP and Uttarakhand, then Bihar and Jharkhand, and then Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, then Madhya Pradesh, and this Chhattisgarh. So these are the things that is empowered under the Constitution itself, and this can be done only by a sovereign state. So under another provision which we find in the Constitution of India regarding sovereignty and aspect that you see the citizenship provisions, that is Article 5 to 11, and that is the part second of the Constitution, where we find that in India we have a single citizenship. So ours is a country where we find that the sovereignty resides in the people of India, and that is the source of the power. And unlike US Constitution, where you find that though their preamble also starts with the "We the people," but that starts in the name of "We the people of United States," not "We the people of" that they have adopted and given to themselves. So there is a difference in the opinion in the US Constitution and in Indian Constitution. They go for the double citizenship, while in India we have a single citizenship. And then again, you see that on this point of the sovereignty, the Constituent Assembly debates when it was going on, Dr. Ambedkar, he also said that the preamble that embodies what is desired by every member of this house, that this constitution should have its roots and authorities, it's from the people of India. That is, the sovereignty should be coming from the people. And this was the viewpoint of Dr. Ambedkar that was also seen in one of the judgment of the Supreme Court, that is in Indira Nehru Gandhi versus Raj Narayan, 1975, when Justice H.M. Beg, when he observed that this term sovereign is used only in the preamble of the constitution. And similar terms, Justice Beg, when he also spoke in Keshwaran Bharti case, that constitution is a legal sovereign and it is recognized by the courts. Although the ultimate political sovereignty may and does reside in the people, but the legal sovereignty resides in the constitution itself. So this was the judgment of the Supreme Court in Indira Nehru Gandhi and in Keshwaran Bharti case, and the observation of Justice H.M. Beg in both these cases were regarding the sovereignty that he decided that he divided in legal sovereignty as well as in political sovereignty. So regarding legal sovereignty that resides with the constitution, and political sovereignty that may and does reside with the people of the country. And similar aspect was also, viewed by Dr. Ambedkar when he spoke in the Constituent Assembly regarding the sovereignty. Then another term which is used in the preamble, that is socialist. Now, regarding socialist, as I also told that this was not in the original preamble when it was enforced in 1950. And when the debates were going on in the Constituent Assembly, at that time, this was argued that we should continue with the term socialist in the preamble, and we must write this socialist term or socialism in the preamble to the Constitution of India. And at that time, we see that Jawaharlal Nehru and Dr. Ambedkar, they both had the commitment towards the socialism in the constitution. They also spoke about the term socialism in the constitution at large. And so when we see that this objective resolution of Jawaharlal Nehru was being moved, so he said that I stand for socialism, and India will stand for socialism, and that India will go towards the constitution of a socialist state. And to the extent that he has also spoken about that, I do believe that the whole world will have to go by that way, because the time when the constitution was being framed at that time, the welfare concept of the state was very much in vogue in the other parts of the world also. And for that, it was required that the socialist approach or socialism should continue with. And Jawaharlal Nehru also said that the first task regarding the framing of the constitution is that we must have a constitution with for the free India, for the independent India. And we need to feed the persons who are starving, and we need to provide the clothes to those persons who are naked. That there was a situation in India at that time when the constitution was being framed and this objective resolution was being passed. So at that time, this was the situation was very pity in India regarding all these conditions, because the people were dying, starving, and the people were not having the clothes to wear, and they were not being given the opportunity for their development, the fullest opportunity to their development according to their capacity. So Jawaharlal Nehru said that at this moment, the most important question and the greatest question is that how to solve these problems of the poor who are starving, who are not having sufficient facilities for their development, for their capacity building. So all these things are required, that we must go for a socialistic approach of the state. We must have the socialism in the constitution. But at the same time, he was of the opinion that we are making a constitution for the future generation. And if we put our own viewpoints in the constitution, or we are giving for the socialist constitution, then naturally for the future generations or the future governance, it would not be proper, because they may have some different political ideology, and we cannot limit the future governance on our doctrine of socialism or our doctrine of economy, or our doctrine of the mixed economy, whatever it is. So we will not write in the preamble the term socialist or socialism, though we are committed towards the socialism. And this is how you see that a great debate was going on the very term to use this socialism in the preamble or not, because socialism is something which means the elimination of inequality, or there shall not be any discrimination, or social justice or economic justice may be given to everyone, and the status and the standard of living should be equal. There shall not be any discrimination in income. So this is something like the term socialism provides for. And you see that socialism is a political doctrine, or it is a system which creates the classless society, casteless society, or we see that the nation's wealth, which is there in few hands, in the private hands, that has to be brought to the public hands. This is what the socialism as a political doctrine means for. And that's why Jawaharlal Nehru, he was also attracted by Fabian socialism. And you see that in some of the books, we find that when he was speaking on the socialism in the Constituent Assembly, then he has also spoken about this Fabian socialism. And when he was the student, and later he developed this idea, and we see that in Lucknow Congress presidential speech that was in 1936, he stated that his attachment to socialism was in the economic sense. And that's why you see that part fourth of the constitution, that is related to the directive principles of the state policy, particularly article 39b and 39c. If you go through the provisions in 39b and 39c, then you see that this socialism, which was basically in the economic sense, is found in this part of the constitution. And we see that social justice that demands the equality along with the liberty. And the country like India, it is necessary that the state must try to improve the persons who are downtrodden, the persons who belong to the weaker sections of the society. And this article 39b and 39c are the real examples where we find that there shall not be any concentration of money, or that should be distributed among the people, or among the downtrodden, among the persons who are belonging to the weaker section. So these are the provisions which we find in part fourth of the constitution. And that's why sometimes we see that the social and economic rights are said to be consisting in part fourth of the constitution. So the entire socialism, or the provisions which are related to the socialism, are found in part fourth of the constitution. Besides the affirmative actions and positive discriminations in part third also, the entire part fourth is said to be based on the economic and social justice, which is an extension of the socialism. Then this socialist word, when it was being inserted by the 42nd Amendment to the Constitution, and particularly it was, with effect from 3rd January 1977. So the word socialist is not defined in the Constitution. This is a true fact. And when the Constitution 45th Amendment Bill was produced before the Lok Sabha, then an attempt was made to define the word socialist. and what shall be the meaning of the socialist. So in that 45th Amendment Bill, that came to be 44th Constitution Amendment. So in that amendment, the attempt was to define this socialism. And you see, the socialist was defined as free from all forms of exploitation, social, economic, or political. So, what shall be the meaning of the socialist? Socialist is something which is free from all forms of exploitation. Exploitation may be political, exploitation may be economic, exploitation may be social. But when the bill was finally adopted as the 44th Amendment Bill, Amendment Act, then we find that it was not consisting of the definition of socialist. So even today, we don't have any definition of the word socialist, though it found place in the preamble to the Constitution of India from 42nd Amendment 1976. And we see that socialism is difficult to define because it has different meaning and different things and for the different people. And as the quote in Axel Weir versus Union of India 1978 case pronounced that the addition of the word socialist in the preamble that might enable the court to lean more and more in favor of the nationalization and state ownership of industry. That is, now you see that after the insertion of the word socialist in the preamble in 1976 by 42nd Amendment, the courts have tried to interpret the provisions of the Constitution in terms of the general meaning of the word socialist. And that's why the first case which was decided by the Supreme Court after this 1976, that was Axel Weir case of 1978, and the court was of the opinion that the courts have to lean more and more in favor of nationalization and state ownership, so that when we were having more and more nationalization, then naturally the downtrodden, the weaker sections of the society, they will be given their due, which was debated by Jawaharlal Nehru, that how to provide the clothes to the naked persons, how to provide the food to the starving person. And if we are going for the nationalization, then naturally we find that there must be a distribution of resources, distribution of the things which are in possession of the state, and that may be equally distributed to all, because the very meaning of the socialism or the word socialist is that free from all types of the exploitation, free from all forms of the discrimination. So if there would be nationalization, then more and more things would be in the hands of all the persons who are belonging to that particular state. So this was the judgment in Axel Weir versus the Union of India. Then another case which was decided by the Supreme Court in 1980, that is Minerva Mills versus Union of India. And here the court was of the opinion that socialism to crystallize as a socialistic state, which has to secure to all its people the socio-economic justice. And how this socio-economic justice can be delivered, how this socio-economic justice can be provided to its people. For that, the Supreme Court in this case said that there must be a fine interplay between fundamental rights and directive principles of the state policy. And that's why you see this was the case where the Supreme Court has come out that the relationship or harmonization between the fundamental rights and directive principle is the basic structure of the Constitution. That is, if you have to interpret any of the fundamental rights, then you have to provide socio-economic justice, and for that you can take clue from the directive principles of the state policy also. Then on this socialism, we find many cases which have been decided by the Supreme Court. For example, D.S. Nakara versus Union of India. And this was a case relating to the pensioners. And you see that the states, they have put some cutoff date that the persons who have got retired after this date, they'll not be entitled or eligible for this new pension scheme, or prior to that they'll be giving some different pensions. So this was on the basis of the financial resources, on the basis of the treasury of the state, that they don't have sufficient amount. So now this was the case DS Nakara, where the court said that we are a socialist state, and in that socialist state, we cannot say that the funds of the state are not sufficient to provide justice to those persons who are really in need of. Because they are the pensioners, they don't have any salaries and incomes, and they are not being provided with. So this is how you see this DS Nakara case also, I mean, defined to certain extent socialism as the things which are free from exploitation and discrimination. Then SR Bommai versus Union of India, there was another case which is related to the economic justice and social justice and economic empowerment, all these things. Then the Samtha versus state of Andhra Pradesh. Samtha versus state of Andhra Pradesh. And this was 1997 judgment. And here you see the Supreme Court has given the judgment in this case when it talked about that the word socialist in the preamble, that must be read from the other with respect to the other articles also. For example, Article 14, 15, 16, 17, which relates to the equality, then Article 21, life and liberty, then 23, that is, right against the exploitation. Article 38, 39, 46, which speaks about the social justice, which speaks about the economic justice, which speaks about the upliftment and the promotive activities by the state in favor of the weaker section, particularly SC and ST. So these are the articles which are to be read when the term socialist has to be expanded. And the court in this particular case said that the Indian approach of the socialism, that is derived from the spiritual traditions, Indian spiritual traditions like Buddhism, Jainism, and some Vedantic and Bhakti Hinduism, Sikhism, and Islam and Christianity also. They all have contributed to this heritage of India, which is rooted in the respect of the human dignity and human equality. And therefore, the Indian socialism is different from what we see in the Marxist socialism or scientific socialism. So to achieve this goal, we have to go through the preamble along with the directive principles and fundamental rights of the Constitution to provide the safe and planned economy. And this was the case, as I told you, was related to the economic empowerment. And that's why the provisions of the Constitution in Part 3rd and Part 4th were also interpreted and read along with the term socialist, which has been in the preamble to the Constitution of India. Then one important case which was decided in 1982 by the Supreme Court, Randhir Singh case. Here the court have said that this is the duty of the judges, and that duty they have to redeem their constitutional oath. You all know that when the judges are appointed, they have to take the oath, that this is there in the constitution schedule. And in this case, just the court said that judges have a duty to redeem their constitutional oath and to do justice no less than to the pavement dwellers than to the guests of the five-star hotels. Simply, it means that the justice has to be delivered, and when the justice has to be delivered, then the judges, they shall not make any difference. They shall not discriminate between the persons who are pavement dwellers and the persons who are the guests of the five-star hotel. Simply, the court wanted in this case to say that Article 14, which speaks of the equality before law and the equal protection of the laws, then there shall not be any discrimination, there shall not be any difference, there shall not be any denial to the right to equality. And simply, this is the duty of the judges also, that they should not discriminate while deciding the cases on the basis of this. So, and this is the sole purpose of the socialism in the preamble to the Constitution of India. But later we see that the attitude of the court was also somewhat changed regarding socialism. And Balco implies Union versus Union of India 2002 case, where the court said that if there is some new economic policy that is coming in, then the wisdom of the parliament cannot be, or the wisdom